Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the end of our first week in isolated remote learning. It's been quite an experience. Um, so I do just want to say a few things. I sent out a number of emails earlier. um, I made a video of my lecture available, a lecture in my social problems class. I made it available for everyone, where I talk about the spread of COVID-19 through social networks happening at an exponential rate. Remember, exponential growth means that things grow very quickly. That's why we're going to see probably millions of cases of COVID-19 in the United States by May. Yeah, it's pretty sobering. So I know that, as I've said, I know that many of you are in less than ideal circumstances right now. So just hang in there. A few announcements to repeat. I got ebook. I sent out an email with a link if you need ebook access for the Norton textbook. I'm in correspondence with Hatchet, the publisher of Connected, and I have to figure out some way to get you ebook access to that as well. So for the packback discussion that's due next week, if you've done it already, that's great. Feel free to comment on chapter. I believe we're on chapter 6 or 7 for next week. But if you want to talk about COVID-19 instead, that's fine. I think that's perfectly appropriate, given that we're heading into a major health and economic emergency. I think it's very sensible and appropriate for us to be discussing that in this class. And I'll be touching upon it as we move forward on each issue that we talk about. I'm trying to incorporate some of this as much as I can. Again, I do just want to stress that we're going to see a lot of pain in the weeks and months ahead. May is going to be a really tough month for America and many other places in the world. This is going to be big. So we're just going to try to muddle through the best we can. I'm going to try and sleep this weekend, trying to get some actual good sleep, which I have not had in a few days as I've been monitoring this thing. And hopefully, tomorrow and Sunday I'll have a much clearer head and, be ready to take on the rest of what's ahead, or at least be able to handle it. So anyway, I just want you to, focus on yourselves right now. As you know, we have an exam planned for next Friday. I'm going to give everyone, considerable time to take it. It's going to be open note, open book. I've already sort of made it, I've had to remove some stuff from it already. So anyway, again, I'll talk about that next week and stuff. So I do want to just kind of go through the final few slides, and there's not very many. Had initially planned more on men, but the world got in the way. So anyway, I'll just kind of go with what I have here. Most of the inequalities are regarding women. So men are going through an interesting moment in human history. There are different aspects of what it means to be male, what it's meant historically, and culturally, and so on. And what these attitudes mean, masculinity, and a lot of it is based upon what men are doing in the economy. And so as the economy changes, gender roles change as well. So I do want to kind of start by talking about an experience that I had. I'm not sure where I should put myself. This is the University of California, Santa Barbara. I know it looks very nice right now. This is where I went to graduate school. Let's see, if you look over to this side where I've got the cursor, the mouse arrow, that's where about roughly 20,000 students are living, kind of packed into about 1 to 2 square miles. It's called Isla Vista, though everyone there has been mispronouncing it as Isla Vista for many years now. So that's what it's popularly known as. So this is kind of an ideal looking place, and kind of a resort community. So my wife and I were living about a block away from where most of the students were living in 2014 when we heard a number of gunshots. And we knew that there were some fights that were growing in frequency in that neighborhood, and we just thought it was sort of an escalation of that violence. Unfortunately, we learned that it was much worse. There was a mass shooting. A young man who was a student at the community college had been posting a series of videos and sort of a video manifesto, really blaming women for his troubles. He was a virgin. He was the first sort of person who gave this idea of incel prominence. Incel meaning involuntary celibate. It's a group of primarily men, mostly men, who are oftentimes in their early 20s, early mid-20s, have not had sexual intercourse, and it's affected their self-esteem in really troubling ways. So he made these series of videos where he basically blamed women for not liking him. He was from a fairly wealthy family, and he showed pictures of the first class, business class, first class seats on planes, and his nice car and everything, and making these videos saying, "Why don't you like me, girls? You never liked me," and so on. And so his plan was to go into sororities and start just shooting women there. He went, I guess he started his killing spree the night before when he killed 3 people in his apartment. And this, I think, was done with knives. The next day, he tried to get into a sorority, could not get in. The door was locked, so he just started shooting people on the streets and outside, and he started shooting people in this neighborhood. There was a shootout, and he shot himself outside of this lecture hall. So it was I don't know how to describe it. It was very disturbing to see a lecture hall that I had taught in, being surrounded with body bags and pools of blood. So this is troubling. And one of the things that came out there that I think has some relevance to today and what we're experiencing is that this happened about 3 or 4 weeks before graduation, and just devastated the community. And so the graduation that year was very somber. It was not a joyous graduation at all. It was a very tearful gathering. But you saw the way in which people did come together, and the amazing things people did for each other. And I think it's a very different situation that we're going through right now, but it's similar in the sense that it's hugely disruptive, and things we had counted on are not happening. So anyway, hang out, hang in there for each other and be there for each other, virtually, if not physically, since we can't physically. So this is, as I said, the one thing that's interesting about this group of men called incels is that they're generally not the sort of stereotypical hyper-masculine, macho, misogynist, that you often think of as hating women. Oftentimes these are men who are fairly reserved, sometimes fairly effeminate in their mannerisms and behavior. And oftentimes they're isolated. Sometimes there's, some suggestions there may be things like some sort of psychiatric conditions that accompany, but I don't know if there's a lot of research to verify that yet. So these are men who usually do not have a history of any violence, and then they go on and, there have been a number of them who have gone on mass shootings spree. So that's alarming. We do find that men in general do commit most most homicides, and are, most heavily represented among victims. They're much more likely to die of suicide than women. We kind of talked about that the first day of class. Excuse me. We also know that boys are more likely to be diagnosed with attention deficit disorders, hyperactivity disorders, and often face harsher punishments. And there's a lot of research that shows that boys of color face a disproportionate harsh punishments. Masculinity, as I said, it's changing. Our understanding of it is changing as well. There was sort of a controversy a couple of years ago when the American Psychological Association issued a number of guidelines for clinicians and for therapists on how to interact with men and boys, and looking at some of the traditional traits of masculinity, such as not being expressive with your emotions, at least not sort of emotions of sadness and empathy and things like that, maintaining sort of a tough exterior, things like this. And the APA has recommended that men try to kind of move away from those attitudes, that it can be bad for your mental health. Now these are guidelines, but they're suggested guidelines. They're not mandated. So psychologists and clinicians can take them as they deem appropriate. But as we do see changes in the economy, we do see changes in gender roles. And I think that's the one thing I really want to stress here, is that the big change in terms of men's behavior is not so much a result of, well, let me back up. The big change in men's behavior is because of the changes in the job market. And that's largely because of globalization. A lot of the jobs today are in the service sector. Less manual labor than in the past, which has historically been where a lot of men have worked. So changes there mean changes in expectations. But we haven't had perhaps a lot of those changes implemented or made clear. Okay, so there are different explanations for what's going on. And for a place I could put myself, so I'll go over here. Okay, go up here. Okay, so you can look at two sort of movements. One is the men's rights movements. This has been around since roughly the 1970s. This looks at the prospects of men, looks at how a lot of men are suffering right now in various ways, especially when it comes to employment and self-respect and things like this. A lot of the men's rights movement have argued that feminism is the main cause of the declining prospects for men. Then you have what might be called the pro-feminist men's movement, but these are men who basically support feminism and believe that what's good for women will be good for men as well. My sort of view is probably maybe definitely more towards the pro-feminist men's movement. I do think that women entering the workforce does change the composition of the labor market in different ways. However, again, when you look at what's happening and what people do, activities that people engage in, the big change again is globalization. You're moving a lot of the manual labor has been moved from the United States elsewhere. So you see in this chart here, these are labor force participation rates by a person's education, and this looking at men. And you see that, back in the 1960s, between 96 and 98% of men, roughly 97% of men, were employed, were working. And this is men who had no college education, men who had higher degrees, and men who had no high school education, roughly the same labor participation rate. That has, changed dramatically since then, especially for those without a high school education. So you see men the labor force participation rate has dropped by about 10% or 10 to 15% since the 1960s. So that's just looking at the amount of jobs in there, but also the composition of those jobs has changed. So again, this is more the service industry that we see. So there was a time, when masculinity was more tied to the type of jobs that people did. And as the jobs change, that's where we start to see that masculinity may need to change. I mean, same thing with femininity. As more women enter the workforce and more women enter jobs, the sort of traditional notions of femininity will probably change. We always have to be careful when we say traditional, because traditional usually it refers to one period of time. We can talk about men and women throughout history and cross-culturally, and we see various different things that men and women have been doing. So big changes, as I said there. It's really hard for men without a high school degree. We see that as the economy depends more and more on technological skills, analytical skills, and so on, we see then that this is going to be harder for men who have not been trained in those areas. And what the coronavirus does to the economy, I have a feeling it's going to accelerate some of these trends we've already seen in terms of distance working, online telecommuting, that sort of thing. But you can't telecommute if you're a plumber, or if you're building a house, or if you're, working at a factory or something like that. So it's not quite clear what's going to happen. We know that boys are doing, pretty badly, are trailing behind girls in many subjects right now. Again, I don't think this has anything to do with the innate characteristics that men or boys are just inherently less able to analyze things and self-discipline and so on and so forth. I think there are, well, we've talked about there are these biological differences. But the cultural differences that are wrapped up in there in complex ways are very powerful as well. So and we can change culture, but we can't always change biology so directly. Again, the other thing, and this is again, it kind of touches upon some of the things to think about with coronavirus. So we know that a lot of men who are outside the workforce or who are working at lower wage jobs, so a lot of men who have lost their jobs in the last few days. A lot of these men are not in good health. There are a lot of men who are addicted to painkillers, have disabilities, but are not seeking help for them. So this is why I have some deep concerns about coronavirus hitting American society. When you look at especially some of these middle-aged men, they are not in good health. They do not have good social support. A lot of the theories that we see, are coming out of this sort of demographic. So this is a really big problem. I mean, it's an immediate problem, I think, for facing COVID-19. These men are in much worse health than their counterparts in China or South Korea. That's something we have to keep in mind. Why are men doing so badly in a lot of these things? Well, there was a study that was done. I think it's been published now. One reason is video games. People are spending more time playing video games, especially men and boys. In fact, it increased by about 3 hours per week over the last few years. And we find that women don't play video games as often or as much. Again, we're speaking in broad generalities. Or make time for their studying. When you look at surveys in terms of study habits right now, female college students are spending more time on their homework, and that's showing. That's showing in the job market and in grades, and who applies to be a teaching assistant, and so on and so forth. So video games, I don't want to demonize video games because they can do some good things as well. There's research that shows that if you play some video games, it does help your cognitive decision making and things like this. Certain motor skills even and so on. But if you can sort of do that and manage it while you're able to do your own responsibilities instead of just sort of binge playing, then excuse me, then it can be very helpful. Otherwise, it can also be very, very, very unhelpful and problematic. So there are a lot of different people who are trying to figure out what's going on with men. I don't necessarily agree with everything that's on with everything in this book, but I think it's provocative. I like to read stuff that I don't necessarily always agree with, just stuff that gets me thinking. So this kind of looks at masculinity and kind of how are we treating it, and how should we address masculinity. If so much of what's been considered masculinity now is problematic, if we're seeing sort of negative mental health effects, negative social effects, and so on, how do we change that? And what are the time scale? What's the time scale that we're talking about, and so on. So anyway. So that's basically it for today's lecture. Our lecture is going to be a little bit shorter because I'm not, I'll post the videos. I'm not going to play them during these presentations. So anyway, again, feel free to post about COVID-19, your experiences, social networks, and so on for Packback this week. Hang in there, everyone. We'll try to, well, as I said, as I will probably end every lecture, we'll muddle through because we're Penn State. All right, have a good weekend.